The Lord be with you. A reading from the Gospel according to Mary. When the Blessed One had said this, he greeted them all. "Peace be with you," he said. "Acquire my peace within yourselves. Be on your guard so that no one deceives you by saying, 'Look over here,' or 'Look over there.' For the seed of the true humanity exists within you. Follow it. Those who search for it will find it. Go then, preach the good news of the kingdom. Do not lay down any rules beyond what I ordained for you, nor promulgate law like the lawgiver, or else the law will dominate you." After he said these things, he left them. And they were greatly distressed and wept greatly. "How are we going to go out to the rest of the world to preach the good news about the meaning of the seed of the true humanity?" they said. "If they didn't spare him, how will they spare us?" Then Mary stood up. She greeted them all and addressed her brothers. "Do not weep, and do not be distressed, nor let your hearts be irresolute. For his grace will be with you and will shelter all of us. Rather, we should praise his greatness, for he has joined us together and made us true human beings." When Mary said these things, she turned their minds towards the good, and they began to ask her about the words of the Savior. A gospel inspired by God. Rabbi Hillel was a contemporary of Jesus. He lived about 50 years, flourished about 50 years before Jesus. And he was regarded as a really, really wise man and an expert in the Jewish scriptures. So on one occasion, a smartass came to him and said to him, "Rabbi, I will convert to Judaism if, while standing on one leg, you can explain to me all of Torah." And then he sniggered. And Hillel stood on one leg, and he said, "Do not do to anybody else what you do not want them to do to you." That is the entire scriptures. Everything else is merely commentary. No, the story doesn't tell us whether the guy converted to Judaism or not, but he certainly got his answer. Now, a few weeks ago, Tom Thomas issued me a similar kind of a challenge. He said, "How would you feel about, in one homily, trying to telescope your cosmology, all your thinking, into one particular homily?" So we traded emails for a while, and then last Friday we had lunch together. And I said, "Okay, I'll give it a go. I'll see if it's possible. If I can try to telescope 66 years of life and 49 years of meditating and 41 years as a priest, if I can telescope that down into one homily, we'll see what happens." Now, I know before I start that it's a ridiculous kind of an exercise, but I'm going to give it a shot. And I know that it could be a long morning. I know that a map is not the terrain, and a cosmology is not the reality. But we need maps to guide ourselves. As long as we realize that the maps are not the terrain, we're okay. And so I'm bearing in mind that Buddhism has a saying that says, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. In other words, if you create a theology that you really believe in, kill it before it kills you. But we need theologies to try to maneuver as we try to understand what God is. And there's a great statement from the Christian mystic Meister Eckhart. He said, "I pray daily to God to rid me of God." So it's the same notion. As soon as we create theology, we try to contain what is basically ineffable. But we have to do it. We have to try to talk about our experiences of the divine. So we have to try to create maps. Now, when you try to create a map, there's two dangers. If you don't put enough detail into the map, then it is useless. People can't find their way to their destination. If I tell you how to get to my house and I draw you a map, but the map is inadequate, there's not enough details in it, you're not going to be able to get to my house. On the other hand, if I put so much detail in it that the map is totally cluttered, you just get confused. So if I put enough detail, the map is actually the same size as the terrain that it's describing. So that's not a whole lot of good. So I have to try to navigate somehow between giving enough detail to let you know what my thinking is, and at the same time not swamp you with so much stuff that I just confuse you in the process. Now, because I'm Irish, I can't be as succinct as Rabbi Hillel. So I'm not going to be able to tell you in one phrase, what my cosmology is. I'd be a bit more like Moses. I'm going to do it in 10 pieces. So I'm going to make 10 main points today. I kid you not. 10 main points, Margie. Yeah? I'll try to do as briefly as I can, and as succinctly as I can, but there's going to be 10 main points I'm going to try to cover. The first one, I'm going to try to define my lexicon. Take some of the key phrases, and tell you what I mean by these phrases. Second point, I'm going to talk about that the only reality ultimately is God. That's my second point. The only reality really is God. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about the grand sweep of evolution. Fourthly, I'm going to talk about planting and tending life, what that looks like, planting and tending life. Fifthly, I'm going to talk about avatars and Buddhas and the relationship between them and between us and them. Number 6, I'm going to talk about volunteering to be human. Then I'm going to talk about the rules of the game. Then I'm going to talk about the journey back home. Then I'm going to create what I'm going to call an equation of enlightenment. And then finally, I'm going to make a concluding statement. So there are the 10 points we're going to go through. Okay? If you're ready for the ride. Hopefully it won't take that long. Okay. So it's really important that we understand the language we're using, because if we don't understand the language, we think we're giving one message and we're giving a different message. So I'm going to just take 4 important terms for me and give a quick definition of what I mean by them. That'll be my first point. And the first one is reality. If we live in the West, we suffer under the misapprehension that something is only real if it's apprehensible to our sensorium, either directly to our senses or by extension through our instrumentation. So we don't believe in the West, pretty much, that anything is real unless we can see it, hear it, taste it, touch it, or smell it directly or through our instrumentation. I totally disagree with that. That is not my understanding of reality. Reality exists in many different levels, some of them more pristine than others. But ultimately, I believe that anything you can sense, anything you can feel, anything you can think, anything you can remember, anything you can dream, anything you can intuit, anything you can imagine, are all real. They exist at different levels of reality. And in order to make our maps of reality, we have to be cartographers of all of those places. So reality for me is much bigger than what we normally take of in the West. That's the first word I want to define. The second one is truth. For me, truth is not the same thing as fact. Fact is simply a data point in the physical cosmos. It's not particularly important. For me, truth is much bigger than that. Something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with Source. And something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with Source. So I'm not particularly interested in factoids. I'm interested in truth. I'm interested in that which can transform me and align me with God. And the factoids are only important in order to manipulate the physical world in which I find myself. But apart from that, they have no great importance. The third one I want to redefine for myself is memory. And for me, memory goes all the way from eidetic memory, which is the tiny memory that remains in your senses after you've, experienced something. So you see something, there's a small memory that lives in your eyes for a few nanoseconds. There's a memory there. Or you hear a sound, there's a memory of the sound that stays in your ear for a little bit of time. So that's kind of eidetic memory. It's that memory held by the sensorium itself. And then at some stage, it goes into short-term memory. And then it goes into long-term memory. I believe that the memories of entire lifetime are available to you. In fact, I believe that the memories of all the lifetimes you've ever lived are available to you. And I believe ultimately in the Akashic records, that everything that has ever happened in any dimension of God's manifest realms has been recorded. That God is a doting grandparent who has videotaped everything every one of our children have ever done. So memory for me is access to all those data points. And the fourth one I want to redefine is imagination. Imagination is not the faculty that allows us to make up stuff that's not real. Imagination is that ability that allows us to shift our state of consciousness, alter our mental frequencies, visit in other dimensions, have encounters with entities and energies that exist in those dimensions, bring them back here, cross-fertilize them with our culture, and therefore expand our models of what's real. That's what imagination is. It's the most important gift an artist has or a scientist has. Real science is based on imagination, the leaps of fantasy, not just the technical data. So that's my first point, and I'm kind of defining the terms that I'm going to use. So the second point then is this. I believe that ultimately only God exists, and that everything that we experience is some kind of an emanation or an articulation of God. Now, when we try to wrestle with this ultimate mystery, all we can do is try to work with metaphors and symbols of some kinds. But we can try to say that God seems to have two aspects. There seems to be a transcendent aspect of God, the isness of God, which is totally ineffable and about which we can say nothing. And then there's the immanence of God. There's God as she breathes and moves through her manifestation. And that we can encounter and that we can experience. To break it into a different way, you could say there are three aspects to God. There's the isness of God, represented by the Father in the Christian Trinity. There's the God's total self-knowledge, represented by the Word of God, or Jesus, in the Christian Scriptures. And then there's God's total love for herself, the total self-acceptance of this mystery. And that's represented by the Holy Spirit. And so I do not believe that God is a person. I don't think that God is some kind of a superhuman being with human attributes. I don't think that's true of God at all. We have projected these onto God, both our virtues and our vices, and just writ them large and claim that this is who God is. I do not believe that God is a person. I do not believe that God is a creator. I don't think God kind of sits in his workshop and thinks, today I think I'm going to make elephants. And then he makes elephants out of nothing. And then he says, I think I'm going to make planets, and then he makes planets. Or he says, I think I'm going to make spiders, and then he makes spiders. I don't think that's what happens. For me, all of manifestation is literally emanation from God. It is the nature of God bleeding into manifestation. And I've used the example many times of a flower pot that somebody gave me years ago, and there was a bulb set in it. But I couldn't see the bulb. And the person who gave it to me says, it's very, very simple. Stick your finger in the clay. If it's dry, put water in it. If it's wet, leave it alone, because I'm deadly with plants. And I put it in the window of my bedroom, and a few weeks later, this green stalk began to emerge of its own volition. And then a few weeks later, the 4 big trumpet flowers emerged. Purple trumpet flowers came out of it. And I can never remember the name of the plant. Amaryllis. Great. So it's not like that the bulb created the stalk, or that the stalk created the 4 trumpets. It was the nature of the bulb to emanate and manifest as stalk, and then subsequently as bulb. And so that's what I see. I do not see God as a creator kind of waving a magic wand and bringing elephants into existence from nothing. But that rather, it is the nature of God. The nature of God's immanence is to manifest in everything that we see around us, whether they're galaxies, or elephants, or spiders, or human beings. So God for me is not a creator. Nor do I believe that God is a covenant maker. I don't believe that God makes particular agreements with particular groups of people. I do not believe that God has that kind of relationship with any group. Nor do I believe that God is a micromanager, that he inserts himself into human affairs and gets really upset when we don't follow his laws. And I do not believe that God is partisan. Rather, I believe that everything that exists is a word of God made flesh. In the Christian dispensation, we make a huge mistake, I believe, by claiming that the Word of God became flesh just once. So in the prologue to John's Gospel, there's a beautiful statement where John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we think this Word is Jesus Christ. When I pray that prayer, here's the version that I use. I say, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh, and you are such a Word. So everything that exists in the phenomenological realms is a Word of God made flesh. So that's what I think about when I think about God. That's my second point. Third point, I'm going to look at the extraordinary then sweep of evolution as it emanates from source. So what is this about? So Darwin would have us believe that evolution is predicated on 3 principles. There is spontaneous mutation, spontaneous genetic mutation, just any kind of mutations, most of which are useless, and that occasionally there's a good one. And then there's a process of natural selection based on survival of the fittest. It's dog eat dog out there. And that this process very, very gradually and very smoothly morphs into more and more complex life forms. That's the Darwinian viewpoint. I don't agree with it at all. I believe that there is an intelligence guiding this entire process. So if you want to call it intelligent design, if you want to use that word, that's fine with me. That's not exactly what I mean. Rather, I mean that there's God's native intelligence is built into evolution, and that therefore there's intelligence to it, that things are not just mutating randomly. There's meaning to the direction they're attempting to take as they achieve more and more complexity. And rather than claim that it's survival of the fittest and dog eat dog, I see much more evidence for cooperation and symbiosis in nature. All life forms, helping each other to survive in their own particular niches. And I do not see evidence for gradualism. In fact, there's no evidence whatsoever in the fossil record that evolution happens in this gradual sophistication. Rather, what we see is evidence for what Stephen Jay Gould called punctuated equilibria, that all of a sudden there's a sudden quantum leap and a whole new feature comes into planet Earth. Now, I have a theory about how that happens, but that's for later in the talk. But so it's not this gradual ascent, rather there's these punctuated jumps, that this is how evolution happens. Most of us, if we were brought up in a kind of the Judeo-Christian model, we have this notion that evolution progresses in the following fashion, that there's only one universe, that there's only life on one planet in this universe, although we know that there are at least 150 billion galaxies containing about 150 billion solar systems each galaxy. We claim that life is only on one of these planets. Then we claim that on this planet there's only one species that has a soul, and that's the human species. And then we claim that there's either a chosen race or there's a special religion that God particularly loves. We think that we only get one shot at life, and that at the end of this lifetime there's a judgment, and then we're concerned we get the thumbs down and we go to hell, or the thumbs up and we go to heaven. So that's pretty much what most of us have been brought up to believe. That's our model of kind of evolution. I see it very, very differently. I do not believe that we live in a universe. I believe that we live in a metaverse which has given birth to a pluriformity of multiverses. And that this little universe that we inhabit is one little baby in a womb connected to other little babies in the same womb by black holes and white holes. And that literally we live in a bubble bath of universes, each of which is precious to God. And that in this particular universe, with its, now we know, they've discovered now over 800 exoplanets, planets similar to Earth that exist in solar systems apart from our solar system. The probability is that there are billions of such exoplanets. For me to think that life only exists on this one is absolutely ridiculous. It's the same thinking that thought that the Earth was flat. So there are other life forms out there much, much more advanced than us. Now, are we the only creatures who have souls? I don't believe that for a moment. I think that every sentient being has a soul. And there are different levels of soul. There are souls that inhabit human spacesuits, and they're fairly sophisticated, but they're not anything like as sophisticated as the souls that decide to inhabit and to vitalize, let's say, a planet or a galaxy. So I think, for instance, that planet Earth itself has a soul, and that this soul volunteered 4.6 billion years ago to inhabit the third rock from the sun in our particular solar system, and to breed life until it would throw up a life form capable of experiencing and recognizing its own divinity, and therefore the divinity of all else that is. So everything from spiders to elephants to daffodils have souls, that they're precious to God. A banana slug is no less important to God than an avatar, as far as I'm concerned. And there is not just one lifetime, to accomplish this journey of evolution. We get as many lifetimes as we need from God. And there isn't a judgment at the end of this process. There's a self-evaluation. There's a sitting with a mentor to figure out, did I really accomplish what I set out to accomplish in the incarnation just finished, or is there work I need to do? And there is no such thing as a heaven, and there is no such thing as a hell, in the sense that there's a place we go to and say, I made it, or damn, I'm screwed for all eternity. There are no such heavens or hells. We create the heavens that we're ready to meet, and we fashion the hells that we're stuck in because of our belief systems and our thinking and our lifestyle. But they're all temporary. The heavens are temporary, and the hells are temporary. We will outgrow the hells, and we will outgrow even the heavens, until finally we realize that we have to keep thinking outside the box until we realize ultimately that there is only God. And we are God in drag. And therefore we can let go of all the intermediary heavens and be one with Source. So for me, that's what the evolutionary trajectory, that's what it really, really looks like as we wend our way back into God. My next point then is, I want to look at life itself then as it's planted and as it's tended. So where does life come from? In this little universe, we believe it's 13.7 billion years of age. But we know that our planet is only 4.6 billion years old. And so there are parts of this universe which are literally 3 times older than planet Earth. Do we want to believe that for 2/3 of its existence, nothing happened until life began to breed on planet Earth? For me, that's totally ridiculous. So I'm totally convinced that life started elsewhere long, long, long before it started on planet Earth, and it became very, very, very complex long, long, long before planet Earth was seeded. But at some stage, life was planted on planet Earth. By whom and how? When Francis Crick, the discoverer of the DNA, was asked about this one time, he said, I believe it is through directed panspermia, that spores came from outer space and settled on planet Earth and began to grow. And somebody asked him, how could spores exist in intergalactic space? And he said, because they were sent here in specially designed capsules. This is Francis Crick. They were sent here in specially designed capsules. Now, I think actually it's a little bit more hands-on than that. I don't think that some extraordinary extraterrestrial civilization just bombarded planet Earth with little capsules filled with spores of life, but rather that they visited here, that many, many different extraterrestrial societies who are much, much more advanced than we are, have visited the planet in the past. And it was a garden, and they planted the garden. And they've come back regularly, and they've weeded the garden, and they've fertilized the garden, and sometimes they've grafted new stuff onto it, and they've genetically modified it, until finally, as we read in the scriptures, they created us in their own image and likeness. So what does that mean? That finally they bred a life form that somehow resembled those who planted the garden. Now, are we talking now about Source, ineffable Source? Are we talking about some very advanced civilizations, who literally tended this garden, planted this garden, fertilized this garden, genetically modified this garden, and continue to look out for it? You read the Christian scriptures, the account of Genesis, it looks like some kinds of sky gods made us in their own image and likeness. And moreover, they got infatuated with the human beings, and they began to breed with them. So there's a very strange statement in the book of Genesis in chapter 6, where it says, very strange phrase, the sons of God found the daughters of men to be really attractive, and they took them to wife, as many as they wanted. And they created the great race called the Nephilim. They're given 2 names in the Hebrew scriptures. Sometimes they're called the Nephilim, sometimes they're called the Anakim. And so according to the scriptures that we believe are the word of God, at some stage, some kinds of sky beings, the sons of God, whoever they are, found the daughters of men, whoever they are, to be very attractive, and they took them to wife, and they bred with them and created a race called the Nephilim. And so in the scripture itself, there's lots of evidence that life on planet Earth didn't just happen. It was seeded, it was planted, and it was tended. And my belief system was that there were many such civilizations that visited. Now, the tendency always is when a very sophisticated, technologically sophisticated society or civilization meets a technologically very primitive group, the primitive group always presume the others are gods. And this happened in your lifetime and my lifetime. The famous cargo cults in the Polynesian islands, when the Japanese and subsequently the American Air Force landed there and started bringing supplies, the local population thought they were gods. And they started imitating their rituals. They started creating runways and building model aircraft, hoping that these gods would come back with more cargo. That's how they get the name cargo, because they started giving the goodies to the locals. So they wanted the gods to come back and give them more goodies. So they create these cargo cults. I'm totally convinced, personally, that religion, as distinct from spirituality, is literally the false worship of advanced civilizations by primitive peoples. And we are the primitive peoples who continue to believe that some kinds of sky gods who were just merely advanced civilizations were in fact Source, and we deferred to Source. So that's what I'm going to say about the life. Next point, number 5. I want to look then at what is the connection between Source, real connection between Source and between creation or between emanation. So I just want to mention avatars and Buddhas. So an avatar is is the transcendence of God reaching down into the immanence of God. It is the ineffable mystery of God revealing itself in the human story. So it's like a downward pointing triangle. The Buddha is human excellence reaching towards the divine. It is humans trying to align totally with their divine nature and finding their way back to the transcendence of God. And if you look at the two triangles, when they intersect, you get a Star of David. When you get the downward pointing triangle, in other words, the revelation of God coming into human affairs, and you get human excellence reaching back towards God, and they begin to overlap, you get a perfect Star of David. So this is a beautiful symbol of what happens between the avatar and the Buddha. And so, in some senses, the avatar is where the transcendence expresses itself and intersects with the immanence of God. And the Buddha is an excellent human being, virtuous and aligned fully, that is reaching back towards the innate divinity. So that is the connection that we have between the two aspects of God, the transcendence and the immanence, between the manifest realms and the ineffable mystery itself. Number 6 then has to do with volunteering to be human. So souls exist in timelessness. And at some stage, all souls volunteer for some kind of incarnational experiences where they voluntarily self-limit in order to try to feel what would it be like to be separated from Source, and to forget temporarily that we are bite-sized pieces of God. What would it be like to try to work our way back? What musculature would we have to develop in order to force ourselves to remember who we really, really are? So at some stage, every soul is going to volunteer for such a mission. Now, they're not all going to come into planet Earth. Some of them will go into different planetary systems, some will go into different dimensions, but all of them will stretch themselves into this kind of game that God plays, which I call hide and go seek. That God plays hide and go seek with herself. She pretends to manifest aspects of herself which forget that they are aspects of herself, and they act as if they're separate from each other, from nature, and from Source. And the game then becomes, can you remember, in the middle of all the vicissitude of incarnation, can you remember anyway that in fact you're not separated from anybody else, and you're not separated from nature, and you're not separated from Source? That becomes the game of working its way back. And so every single one of us has volunteered for that. And as we volunteered for it, we came down roped together. None of us came down as individuals. We came down roped together in what I've called soul pods. So we find that there are people in our lives, and I believe that we have moved from incarnation to incarnation with the same troop of characters. The roles are different from lifetime to lifetime, and the relationships are different, the genders may be different, the IQ level may be different, the socioeconomic status may be different, the ethnicity may be different, the religious affiliation may be different, but it's the same pod, the same group of souls, moving from incarnation to incarnation, creating a drama which affords every individual soul the ideal circumstance in order to develop the particular virtue or virtues they want to work on for an incarnation, whether that's compassion or courage or patience or integrity, whatever it is. And we also bring into our lives people from what I've called our shadow pod. There will be people in our lives who will really test us. And they're as important to us as the people who love us, because we need weeders and fertilizers in our garden in order to make the gardens grow. And we need weeders and fertilizers in our psyche and in our spirituality to make our soul advance and grow. So we'll bring into our lives, by agreement, people that we find really, really difficult to be around. And that's why Jesus will say, you must love your enemies. He's not talking about lying down and have people walk all over you. He's saying recognize that you contracted with each other, that these people will be part of your life to test you and to weed in your life. So that's part of the rule of volunteering for being human. And we come with particular kind of equipment. We come with basically 4 aspects. We come with physicality, we come with emotionality, we come with intellectuality, and we come with personality. And each of them is just equipment for the journey. And so physicality is the spacesuits we inhabit with the particular organs and the particular sensorium, and that's part of what we need in order to experience incarnation. We come with the mammalian gift of emotions, so that we can relate to life not just at a physical level, but at a level of compassion. We come with intellect. So we got minds, the ability to reason, and the ability to think about thinking. So this is part of the equipment. And we come with a personality, which is the interface between the spacesuit and the environment. And these are all part of the equipment. And one last point on that piece, I want to distinguish very clearly between the brain and consciousness. I'm totally against the materialistic, reductionistic scientific model that we have in the West, that consciousness is merely an epiphenomenon of brain activity. That we got a particular brain, a bioelectrical circuitry, which in the process of performing creates the illusion of consciousness. For me, that's pathetic, absolutely pathetic. So rather, I believe that the brain is simply a tuning mechanism that consciousness chooses to use in order to broadcast in a particular wavelength. And so thinking that the brain produces consciousness is like thinking that the TV set creates the ball game in Candlestick Park. And somehow that you're watching on a small little black and white television set, the 49ers are playing, and they're playing horribly. And you're thinking, oh my God, if I can just rush out to Best Buy and get a 52-inch plasma high-definition screen and plug it in, the 49ers are going to play better. That's how ridiculous it is. To think some of that, the size of our brain or the ability of our brain is going to improve the quality of consciousness. All it does is it improves the quality of the video and the audio. It's not interfering with consciousness at all. Consciousness is anterior to. So consciousness creates brain and uses brain as a transducing mechanism. It is not an epiphenomenon created by brain. That's the next point I want to make. Where am I in my safari at this stage? 7. Okay, number 8. Moving right along. Okay. I want to look at what are some of the rules of the game then. When you sign up for incarnation and you agree to be part of this experiment, what are some of the rules of the game? And some of the rules of the game is that we have to learn to infer from our experiences how the system works. And so inference is the ability to draw conclusions and to recognize patterns in our experiences. And so one of the primary ones is, realizing that we live in a physical universe, which in fact is just the printout of a metaphysical universe. So the Greeks had 2 words for it. They spelled cosmos with a C, meaning the physical universe in which we find ourselves, and they spelled cosmos with a K, meaning the metaphysical undergirding that's responsible for the physical articulation. And so it is attempting to infer from the cosmos with a K, the metaphysical universe, attempting to infer how the system works so we can play the game properly. So a typical example, for instance, is when you pay attention, you can infer the law of karma. And the law of karma simply is that every action has a consequence. And if you like the consequence, keep doing the action. If you don't like the consequence, stop doing the action. And this is a law of science, and it's a law of spirituality. And so to learn how to play the game, we have to become scientists of spirituality. There's a science of spirituality. The typical scientific method is that your typical scientist will amass make a bunch of observations, amass a whole bunch of data, look at our data, begin to recognize some patterns in our data, create a hypothesis to explain the putative pattern, set up an experiment to test it. If it turns out to be correct, then it will be repeated or replicated in a few other laboratories. And if we all get the same answer, it's a new scientific principle. But at some stage, anomalous data come in, and we have to tweak our models. And then sometimes so much anomalous data come in that we have to dismantle the old models and erect brand new ones. And this happened twice in the 20th century with quantum mechanics and with relativity theory. That the old Newtonian model was utterly inept at the microcosmic level and had to be totally revamped. And so we have to do that with our spirituality. We have to, as in the course of our observations, we have to be awake. We have to collect data from our experiences. We have to begin to recognize patterns or laws here. We have to test them out. We have to cross-reference with other people, and then we establish some kind of a cosmology or some kind of a rule of order for ourselves. So we navigate through the system in a scientific fashion. Spirituality is a science, and this is a science that allows us to become mysticists. It's a word I coined many, many years ago. A mysticist is a cross-fertilization of a mystic and a scientist. It's the ability to be scientific about our spirituality, as much as we are spiritual in our science. And so becoming mysticists rather than dogmatists, opting for gnosis instead of just dogma, that this is the science. This is the way we plan our journey. This is what the rules of the game look like. And the most important rule of all, when you examine the metaphysical universe, the most important rule to infer, much more important even than the law of karma, is the law of love. And that ultimately, the only thing that works is love. We can try greed, we can try violence, we can try anxiety, we can try fear, we can try anger. None of them work. They all create situations of just more anger and more fear and more depression and more violence. The only thing demonstrably showing that the system improves is by acting with love. Because ultimately, the evolutionary trajectory is a single safari that started in God's womb and ends in God's heart. It started in love, it was conceived in love, and it nurtured and ends on love. And we have to infer those things and begin to act according to those principles. Am I at 8 here? Okay, number 8. Okay. The return journey. What is the journey back into God? What does the journey back into God look like? So, the first thing is to realize the philosophical fallacy of the myth of the given. It's a fallacy in philosophy. It's called the myth of the given. And it's the belief system that our sensorium is giving us an accurate one-to-one map of what's out there. And so when we look out or we listen or whatever, that our sensorium is delivering us an absolutely radically accurate map of what's out there. And it's a myth. It can't do that. All we can say is that given the particular senses we have, we've got 5 senses with very narrow ranges, and we've got a tiny little laptop between our ears, and when you apply that very narrow group of senses and this little tiny laptop, here's the model you're able to create. If you had a bigger laptop or you had an extended sensorium, you'd have a totally different model out there. So to give you a graphic example, if you take the electromagnetic spectrum discovered by science, and that's only a tiny portion. Obviously, there's a lot more to the electromagnetic spectrum than even modern science can comprehend. But you just take what we can see at the moment, counting X-rays, gamma rays, heat rays, radio waves, TV rays, the visible spectrum, and you stretch that out. Imagine it's a line connecting New York to Los Angeles. And then you pick out the visible part of that spectrum, the part we can actually detect. You want to guess how big it'll be? 3,000 miles from from New York to LA is the electromagnetic spectrum that science knows about. How big is the visible spectrum?
300 miles.
It's the diameter of a dime. The diameter of a dime. So in this entire electromagnetic spectrum, spanning 3,000 miles, and that's only what science knows about right now, the visible spectrum is the diameter of a dime. And we insist on making our maps of reality from that place. It's absolutely ludicrous, totally ludicrous. So what do we need to do? We need to shift the wave banks. We need to shift the frequencies constantly and move into different kinds of experiences. We need to begin thinking and experiencing outside the box so that we can make our maps of reality less inaccurately, at least. They'll never be accurate, but they can be less inaccurate. So imagine for a few minutes that you're an explorer 200 years ago, and you went to Africa. You'd heard of this continent called Africa, and you want to find out what kind of wildlife lives in the jungles in Africa. And you go to Africa with 100 mouse traps, and you set them all over the forest. And then you come back in a month's time, and you look, and there's a mouse caught in each of them. You say, wow. So Africa's jungles, contain only mice. If you put out mouse traps, you're only going to catch mice. What do you expect? That an elephant is going to get caught in a mouse trap? And that's what we're doing with our little models. We're setting mouse traps in the cosmos, and we're capturing this tiny little slice of reality, and we're claiming that's all that's out there. It's absolutely ludicrous. You put out mouse traps in Africa, you're only going to catch mice. You put out this kind of mindset, you're only going to catch materialistic science. So we have to have the courage to change the channels, to experiment constantly with altering our states of consciousness. And when we do that, then we really have real-time experiences with different energies and different entities, and then we can bring them back and cross-fertilize that knowing with our current models and extend what we mean. Which brings me to number 9. On Wednesday, I have a little pilgrimage tour that I do around my house. I got 23 stations of the cosmic prayer, and I have a little bell at each one, and I ring the bell, and I pray that prayer there. And I'm walking around, and I have this really, really sudden realization. I said, I need to create a simple equation of evolution. What would that look like? And immediately the 4 components came to me. And so I'm going to say today, the equation of evolution is this. E standing for the equation of enlightenment. E stands for enlightenment. Enlightenment is equal to ax1 plus bx2 plus cx3 plus dx4. And X1 stands for self-understanding or self-identification. X2 stands for intelligence, and I'll explain these terms in a few minutes. X3 stands for wisdom, and X4 stands for compassion. You put those four pieces together, and you weight them appropriately, and you have an equation for enlightenment. So X1 means, self-identification. To the extent that we misidentify with our physical bodies or with the physical world, where we cannot become enlightened beings. Our enlightenment is really, really slowed down. So we have to realize that we are spirits in spacesuits. We have to realize that we are souls on safari on planet Earth. We have to realize that we're bite-sized pieces of God. So until we come to that self-understanding and that self-identification, there is no chance of becoming an enlightened being. X2 is intelligence. And by intelligence I mean the ability to be aware of, to understand, and maybe even to control the physical environment in which we find ourselves. That's intelligence. So intelligence is the ability to understand and to be able to manipulate or control our physical environment, our physical bodies and the communities in which we live, and maybe even our climate. So that's what intelligence looks like to me. X3 is wisdom, and this is the ability and the faculty of understanding and aligning with the metaphysical universe, not the physical universe, but the metaphysical universe. The ability to understand the principles, the cosmic principles with a K, and to align fully with those, that is wisdom. And then compassion is the understanding and the practice of treating all sentient beings as my neighbor. That's what real compassion is. Compassion is the ability and the practice of treating all sentient beings as my neighbor. You put this equation together, and then you weight them. So I just played around with this model, for a few hours. And I said, what if each was on a scale of 0 to 100? So 0 representing the total absence of that, and 100 perfection. So what would it look like to be, a 90 or a 95 on self-knowledge? It would be to really understand that I have a body, but I'm not my body. I have emotions, but I'm not my emotions. I have an intellect, but I'm not my intellect. I have a personality, but I'm not my personality. I'm a bite-sized piece of God. So that the high score would represent I'm getting close to that. Intelligence from 0 to 100 would represent my ability to understand how the physical cosmos works, how people operate, how cultures, what creates cultures, what makes me happy or sad. So that's what intelligence would look like. So I could score on that. Wisdom would be my understanding and my realization of how the metaphysical, the spiritual universe works. So I could score from 0 to 100 on that. When I came to the compassion piece, I realized that all of the others go from 0 to 100, but this one goes from minus 100 to plus 100. Because the others you can be zeroed out on, but you can't be negative in. Compassion you can. Not only can you lack compassion completely, but if you were a psychopath, you could take pleasure in either watching or inflicting torture on somebody else. So you can actually be in minus numbers when you come to compassion. And so I created a matrix, a 6-column matrix, just for the fun of it. And in the first column, I put the names of famous people. Jesus, the Buddha, Muhammad, Mahatma Gandhi, Einstein, Hitler. I put those in one column. The second column was the self-awareness piece. The third column was intelligence. The fourth column was wisdom. The fifth column was compassion. And then the sixth column was the total. And I, just for the fun of it, I plugged in a whole bunch of numbers. Where did I think Jesus was in kind of self-awareness? How intelligent did I think he was? What about wisdom? How much wisdom did he have? How about, his compassion? And I plug in numbers and I get a total from him. I did the same with the Buddha, did the same with Muhammad, did the same with Hitler, with Gandhi, and just plug the names and the numbers in, just to see where they would lie on the spectrum. I'm not going to tell you the results, but I'm going to invite you to do it for yourself. I'm going to invite you at some stage, create just a simple matrix of those 4 pieces. Self-awareness, intelligence, wisdom, and compassion. And plug in any character you want and give them grades and add it up and find out the people that you experience, your heroes or the villains of the piece, where do they rate, in that scale. And then plug yourself in. Where do you figure in that scale? What number? You're going to be someplace between minus 100 and plus 400. See where do you rate on that scale. And my final point then, number 10, good stuff, we're almost finished. The conclusion I come to then is this, and this is not just kind of advertising, but for the last year I've been co-authoring a book with 2 other psychologists, a guy called Matt McKay and a guy called Ralph Metzner, and the book will be in the bookshops on May 1st, so it's only 10 days off. And the name of the book is called Why, What Your Life is Telling You About Who You Are and Why You're Here. And in that book, we've tried to address, some of these issues. And it's available beginning, I believe, on May 1st as the book's day. But what we had tried to do in that book was we tried to dismantle old, dysfunctional cosmologies that said the secret to happiness is, to avoid pain, seek pleasure, and pursue power. That hasn't worked for 100,000 years. We tried to erect different cosmologies that put together the mission of the universe, the mission of the planet, and the individual mission. The third target we had was to try to give hints to help people identify what your particular mission might be. And then the fourth was a series of exercises so that you come into alignment with that mission. So that would be kind of a little synopsis of some of the stuff that I'm doing here today. And my final metaphor is this. If I want to sum up the whole thing, I would say that life is like a jigsaw puzzle. And when you take a jigsaw puzzle back from the shop, you buy a new jigsaw puzzle, and you tumble all the pieces out onto the table. You first, typically, if you're typical, you're going to identify the four corner pieces and put those in position. And then you're going to identify the straight lines and put those in. And then you've got 3 clues for the rest of the pieces. The contours, the colors, and the picture on the box. And now you're trying to assemble, the jigsaw puzzle on the basis of those clues. So what would be the 4 corner pieces for you? What are the 4 kind of pillars of your understanding of your life? And what are the lines that kind of hold you together and ground you in your life? And what are the colors and what are the contours of the experiences you've had so that you can put them together? But most importantly of all, do you have any idea what picture is on the box? Because if you don't have any idea what the picture is that's on the box, there is no way you can create the puzzle. So the picture on the box is you. The picture on the box is the divine face of every single one of you. And if you don't know what that looks like, it becomes really, really difficult to put the puzzle together. And the greatest bummer of all is this. When you throw the contents of the box out on the table, you have to realize immediately that everything that's there is necessary. And everything that's necessary is there. You're not going to have to go down to the shop and buy 10 more pieces to complete the puzzle. Or you're not going to wind up with 15 pieces left over. And so the greatest pity of all is that a person comes to the end of their life and there are big gaps in the jigsaw puzzle of their life and a whole bunch of pieces that have never been used. You know that you're living life to the full if there's no holes in your jigsaw puzzle and there's no pieces left aside. Was anybody timing that? I have no idea. Mark? Yeah. How long did that last? I just want to know how. 40 minutes. That's good. Good. Brilliant. Yeah. Great. So, Mark, you had a question.
Okay. Granted that the Earth was seeded long ago, and by some advanced civilization who was perhaps even seeded by some even older civilization, if we go back far enough, we have to inevitably get to the father civilization. If God is not a creator, where did they come from?
Okay, great. It's a great question, Mark. So, you know the old Chinese proverb about the Chinese emperor who asked his wise man, what does the world rest on? And the wise man said, sir, it rests on the back of a great big lion. And the emperor says, okay. And what's the lion standing on? And he says, the lion is standing on the back of a huge tiger. And the king says, okay, good. And what's the tiger standing on? He says, the tiger is on the back of a great big elephant. And the emperor says, okay. And what's the elephant standing on? And the wise man said, it's standing on the back of a great, great big turtle. And the king said, okay, that's good. But what's the turtle standing on? And the wise man said, from there on down is turtles all the way. Okay? So in other words, you have to break the paradigm at some stage. You have to come out of physicality completely. So if you have to come away from the notion of the physical universe itself, which is seeded by people who are seeded by people who are seeded by people, and you have to break to go into a totally different frequency, into the metaphysical realms where there is no time whatsoever and there is no causation whatsoever. All the laws of physics break down when you transcend, you get out of this, the physical universe, which is based on time, space, and causation. And you come out of that completely into a realm in which there is no time, there's timelessness, there's no space, and there's no causation. So at that stage, you're in the ineffable mystery of God, which we can experience, but which we can't define. Johanna.
I have a question about personality. And I think that you said that personality is the interface between ourselves and the world. And is there a connection with soul? And if someone is doing kind of soul level work, can that manifest on the outside? So is it just, yeah.
Yeah, totally. So my definition of personality, in psychology there's many different definitions of personality. Some of them really kind of scientific. So there's called a 16PF, a 16 personality factor. So there's some psychologists who believe there are 16 particular factors, and the weighting of these factors creates the illusion of personality. I don't believe that's true. For me, personality is what happens when an essence meets an environment. Any essence meets any environment. And depending on the essence, you can put the same essence into two different environments, and two different personalities will emerge. Or you can put, two similar essences, you put two different essences in the same environment, and different personalities will emerge. So the personality is always the interface between the core soul and the environment in which the soul finds itself. Yeah. And so the work of the soul then is I find myself in a particular environment. What is the appropriate response to this environment? And that's how the soul then begins to grow. Yeah. Somebody, Jenny.
Okay. This might be a little jumbled, but I want to go back to your comment that God is a higher entity we worship, and that, then maybe above that, if you will. I mean, the hierarchy breaks down with the turtle thing. But my question is, I've read Sri Aurobindo, and Sri Aurobindo talks about the mother. Some people call it the void, whatever. So if you have this ineffable entity, and then everything emanates from there, my question, I guess, becomes, as we go on our journey, and we begin to transcend stages, and we begin to transcend mind, what's the dialogue between ineffable source and one of the things that I've been working with recently, or been made aware of recently, I'm going to segue a little bit, is that there is the renunciation practice where we push away material goods and clothing and whatever, and there's something that's called a variety of things, but one of them is deity yoga. I was talking to George a little bit about this before the service, where what we do is we invite in the entity or source and emanate that to the world to be a benefit. So what's the dialogue or the connection between the void, oneness, the source, and that? So
for one thing, dialogue is only possible in a dualistic model. There can only be dialogue if there's a separation. And so relationship is predicated upon a dualistic viewpoint. But ultimately, there isn't a dualism. And so when you look at the kind of cartography of mysticism, they talk about 4 different kinds of mystical states. The first one is kind of nature, mystical, awareness. You're in nature and you're just filled with this extraordinary sense of peace stuff. The next one is deity mysticism, as you mentioned, where there's some kind of a relationship with a divinity of some kind of Jesus figure or a Buddha figure or whatever, a Krishna figure. The third stage is a non-dual awareness, what's called Turiyatita in Buddhism, which is the ability to know that you're one with, but you're separate as well. So you can watch what your actions are doing, you can watch what emotions you're having, for instance, but not identify with them. Or you can watch what your body is doing. I had such an experience when I was dying of typhoid at one stage in Kenya. I thought I had malaria. I was treating myself for malaria, and I was dying of typhoid. And I was watching my body, tremendous fever, was absolutely shaking, and my emotions were all over the place. I was sure I was dying. And a voice went off inside, somewhere deep inside me, and it said, your body is doing what bodies are built to do, but you're not your body. and your emotions are doing what emotions are built to do, but you're not your emotions. And there's extraordinary calmness. And so I could watch my body. It was still shivering, it was still feverish, but there was a part of me just observing it. So there's a part of me that was not identified with the carcass or the kind of the spacesuit. And there was a part of me that was in the spacesuit experiencing the pain and the discomfort. So that's the third stage of mysticism called Turiyatita, or non-dual mystical state. And the fourth stage is called formless mysticism, where there's no dialogue possible because there's no relationship possible because there aren't two beings anymore. There's just isness. And so dialogue, and prayer are only possible until we get to the final stage of merging with Source. And then when we really merge with Source or with the void, there isn't any other dialogue possible. There's just the isness of being. Yeah. Pat. Pat.
Can we be in that last stage at times and be utterly, fairly utterly unconscious?
Yes.
Most of the time, in other words, it really isn't a linear kind of thing, right?
Great question. The only word I would quibble with was go unconscious, because we're not unconscious at that stage. We're in contentless consciousness. There's a big difference between being unconscious, which means being unaware of, and being in a contentless consciousness where you're in the pure, energy of consciousness per se, but there are no artifacts. You're not observing or you're involved with anything separate from, because you're connected with. It's the difference between, if you sit at the banks of a river, the difference between watching the river and watching the contents of the river. So most of us, we tend to get, distracted by what's in the river. There's a little fish in it, or there's weeds in it, or there's stones at the bottom of it, but that's what catches our attention. But if we could somehow, distract ourselves from that and just watch the river itself, just the water, it's a very different experience. And so when you do this every night, when you go into deep dreamless sleep, you're in contentless consciousness. There's a consciousness there, but your waking consciousness is unaware of that. But there's no content to it. As distinct from dreams, when you're dreaming, there's content to your consciousness. But when you're in deep dreamless sleep, there is no content, but there's consciousness there. And some of the great avatar and Buddha figures, they can literally become aware in the deep dreamless sleep of the consciousness itself. They can inhabit and be the consciousness, in spite of the fact that there are no elements in it. So they can train themselves, for instance, over the course of the night, you'll go through 6 sleep cycles, all of which will involve some period of dreaming. And when the dream ends, before the next dream starts, there'll be a period of contentless consciousness. So some of these yogis will train themselves to become lucid in their dreaming. So they're aware during the dream that it is a dream. And they're watching what's happening in the dream, but they're not attached to it. And then the dream ends, and there's nothing, but they're still conscious. And they're conscious, they're in pure consciousness, and when the next dream starts up, they'll watch the contents of that dream. But they won't get kind of addicted to it, and when that ends, they'll be in pure consciousness again. So that we experience that, every one of us, on a regular basis. And if we're meditating for a long time, we can occasionally access that again. But it is not an unconscious state, it's pure contentless consciousness. Yeah. Tom.
So good morning. Sean, on your equation for enlightenment, so it just struck me, and tell me if this breaks down the parallelism between what Alfred read in terms of faith, hope, love, and compassion.
Okay.
And would there be such a thing as, if you will, the evolution of enlightenment to take it from the ancient scriptures to where you find yourself today?
Okay, interesting. I mean, the truth is you can take any word and massage it and make it mean something else. So I could transplant Alfred's reading this morning and morph it onto my equation and, brutalize the terminology until it fit in. But I don't want to do that because this was, this guy got there 2,000 years before me, and it's a different kind of model. And so in a sense, all we're doing is we're trying to lay down some kind of a template on our experiences. So for instance, how many degrees are there between the freezing point of water and the boiling point of water? There you go. Depends totally on the scale. If you're using a Fahrenheit scale, there's 180 degrees difference between 32 and 212. If you're using Celsius, it's only 100. It's the same water, freezing and boiling, but depending on the template you lay down on it, you're going to get different kind of demarcation points. The same thing is true about personality. How do you understand personality? There's a very simple one. You're either introvert or extrovert. That's a two category model of the personality. Another model is the 16 personality factor. You put down 16 different. Or you take the Enneagram, which is 9 categories, and you impose that on people, and you create. So it depends. The template you put down is going to determine, the categories you're going to emerge with. So that was a category put down 4,000 years ago with particular words, and here was a category I put down, on Wednesday with 4 different words. Yeah. Laurie.
I have a question about if you can give more insight on the history of how our religion created this need for forgiveness and our relationship with it in a more healthy way.
That's brilliant. So Laurie's question was, can I give some kind of background or history to how our religion create the notion of forgiveness and the need for forgiveness? Obviously, it's based on a very, I believe, immature model of God and our relationship to God. But it's like it was an age-appropriate, each stage was an age-appropriate understanding of the relationship. And it's based basically on the thorniest problem in theology is called the theodicy problem, the why bad things happen to good people. And all great civilizations have wrestled with this. But to be more kind of specific for a few minutes, when I go through the Judeo-Christian scriptures, I've identified 6 stages in this process of, I call it the stages of culpability and the need for reparation. And the first stage happens at the very, very beginning of the book of Genesis. It's the story of the fall of Adam and Eve. And so the story is this, that God makes Adam and Eve, puts them in the garden, they can eat anything they want, but there are 2 trees they're not to touch. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. But the serpent comes and he tempts the woman to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and she eats it, and then she gives it to Adam, and he eats it, and then they suddenly realize they're naked, and they hide. And God comes down in the cool of the evening and says, Adam and Eve, whoa, where are you guys? And they're hiding. And he's looking around and he finally finds them. He said, why didn't you answer me? And they said, because we were ashamed. And he said, what are you ashamed about? They said, because we suddenly realized we were naked. And he says, who told you were naked? And Adam says, the woman you gave me, companion, she tempted me and I ate the apple. And he says to him, why did you do this? All the other trees in the garden, you had to eat this one? And she says, it's this guy, it's the snake, the serpent. He tempted me and he told me you'd be really, really good, and I ate it. And God says to the serpent, why did you do that? And the serpent says, you made me. And so the first stage of culpability I call passing the apple. Nobody will take responsibility. And because nobody will take responsibility, everybody gets punished. Everybody gets punished. Everybody's kicked out of the garden. He says to the serpent, everybody who sees you will try to kill you. And you, woman, you will bear children in pain. And you, man, you're going to earn your bread in the sweat of your brow. So everybody gets punished, and they get kicked out of the garden for the sin of the first pair. So that's passing the apple. One group, there's one sin, everybody gets punished in perpetuity. That's the first stage. The second stage comes from a few thousand years later, and God realizes that he's not doing really well in the popularity polls. So he needs to kind of shake up his image a bit. So he talks to Moses, he says, you know what, I've changed my mind. I'm not going to punish people in perpetuity. I'm only going to punish people for the 3rd and 4th generation. So a person commits a sin, I'll punish him, I'll punish his children, I'll punish his grandchildren, and I'll punish his great-grandchildren, but after that, they're free. This lovely, benevolent, compassionate God. So the second stage is, there's a shelf life to God's anger with people. It's 4 generations. The third stage is called the scapegoat. It also comes through Moses. And Moses set up a system whereby once a year, each Israelite would come to his brother Aaron, who was the high priest, the first high priest, and confess their individual sins to Aaron. And then Aaron would take a young goat from the flock, impose hands on it, and confess the sins of all the group onto the goat, and then send it off into the desert. And that's the origin of the term a scapegoat. So the goat took the sins of everybody. So now we got the opposite from stage 1. In this first stage, there's one sin and everybody is punished. In this one, everybody sins, but only one person is punished. The goat is punished and sent off. That's stage 3. Stage 4, it comes with Ezekiel and Jeremiah. Jeremiah flourished about 600 BC and Ezekiel about 50 years later. And they both quoted this Hebrew proverb that said, The parents have eaten sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge. In other words, it was the parents who ate the sour grapes, but somehow their teeth aren't affected. It's their children's teeth that are affected. And both Jeremiah and Ezekiel said, no longer will this proverb be quoted in Israel. From now on, only the person who commits the sin will pay the consequences of it. So that looks like that's the ultimate, It doesn't get much better than that. You're just personal responsibility. But there are, in fact, 2 stages after that. And they come from another great Jewish rabbi, Jesus Christ. And he brought it 2 stages further on. And the 5th stage was this. He said, anybody who makes unjust laws is creating lawbreakers, and the lawmakers are responsible for the sins of the lawbreakers. You create ridiculous laws like the Patriot Act or Citizens United. People who break those laws and are regarded as criminals, it is the lawmakers who are responsible for that sin. Not the breakers, but the makers. So that's the 5th stage of it. And the 6th stage was, Jesus himself, he dedicated his entire life to loving everybody, the perpetrators and the victims. So the ultimate response, to the theodicy problem was to dedicate a life of compassion where nobody was excluded. So they're the stages that I see across through Laurie in the scriptures. And so in the final stage, there's no need, we don't ask forgiveness of God, but of each other. So there's a beautiful prayer in the closing of the book of the Jewish New Year every year. There is a beautiful prayer at the very, very end called the Kol Nidre. And the Kol Nidre is a confession of sins. But you listen to the Kol Nidre, and there's not a single mention of God in the Kol Nidre. At no stage is the congregation asking forgiveness of God, ever. They're asking forgiveness of each other, because our sins do not affect God at all. Our sins affect each other, and they affect ourselves and our cultures. And so, with that, we've outgrown the notion that we've offended some kind of a divinity who's really angry with us and is going to punish us. Margaret.
But God made the law
Which law?
to add leave.
No. Okay, great. Go ahead.
And you said
Okay.
the lawmaker is responsible.
Uh-huh.
So what was God's answer to the
Okay. That's a great question. What was God's answer to the snake? For the first thing, I don't believe that it was God, that the story of Genesis is not about God at all. It is about, an extraterrestrial civilization, whom we regarded as gods, who gave us, our technology and our science and our agriculture, our machinery, our transport systems, and a whole bunch of ethical codes, some of which were good and some of which weren't good. It had nothing to do with, source coming down and revealing moral codes to us. So when I talked about God earlier on, I said I do not believe that God is a covenant maker or a lawgiver. God does not make laws whatsoever. God creates an evolutionary trajectory from which we infer, cosmic laws. They're kind of built into the system. But ethical norms have changed radically over the years. So God did not say to Adam and Eve, I'm putting you into a garden, you can eat anything you want, don't touch that tree, and don't touch that tree. They're totally symbolic. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil has to do with humans at some stage becoming self-reflective and being able to decide between a moral action and an immoral action, and then they're thrown out of paradise, because paradise is the kind of the innocence of not knowing right or wrong. So a little child of 4 is neither moral nor immoral. They're simply amoral. They're not old enough yet. Literally, the hardwiring isn't in place to be able to distinguish between right and wrong. They can learn rules, they can be told rules, but they can't put themselves in somebody else's shoes. So until we can walk in somebody else's moccasins, we can't be either moral or immoral. So that first one was, in some senses, a symbol of the human species evolving to the stage where they've become self-reflective and therefore can make moral choices for the first time ever. And then they're thrown out of the garden of the innocents. The tree of life has to do with, there's a very interesting story, again in the book of Genesis, where it talks about the longevity of the patriarchs. And it says, Adam lived to be 920 years, and then he died. His son Seth lived to be 915 years, and then he died. And it gives a whole long list down. Methuselah lived to be 969 years, and then he died. And then at some stage, God foreshortened, and thereafter the lifespan was only going to be 120 years max. So what was this foreshortening? That this is really weird. I'm going to go really weird at this stage. Since we were built in the image and likeness of, I believe, an advanced extraterrestrial society, they manipulated our genetic code at some stage and shortened the lifespan. And now we're working medically to try to undo some of that damage. So when you actually look at the human DNA, there's a lot of splicing has happened. Splicing DNA has to do with cutting a sequence of DNA, either removing it and joining up the other two pieces, or flipping it over and rejoining it, or inserting it someplace else. And genetic splicing is done biochemically. It's not that you're taking your scissors to it. You split it biochemically. And what they found is that in most of the primates, there are maybe 40 or 50 mistakes where the gene sequence has been spliced and reassembled wrongly. There's over 4,000 mistakes in the human DNA sequencing. So somebody got in there and messed around, split it, maneuvered it in some ways, and the result was that, one part of it was that our longevity was affected. Yeah. So I don't think God had anything to do with either the apple or the tree of life. Karen.
So the expulsion from the garden was...
Is that on? Yeah. Is it on, Mike?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So the expulsion from the garden was not a fall. It was a necessary first step,
Yes.
which then was not a fall from grace,
Yes.
which was not something that needed to be redeemed, which was never any of those things.
Brilliant. Great question. It wasn't a fall. In my opinion, it wasn't a fall. It's the transition from innocence to... I believe that all children are born really, really innocent. They kind of just look around the world in extraordinary awe and curiosity, but they don't have a whole lot of street smarts. At some stage, maybe the early teen years, innocence bifurcates into either naivete or idealism. Naivete is age-inappropriate innocence. So if you get a 15-year-old, who's totally out to lunch, and has no street smarts, they're going to get in trouble. So it's taken over by idealism, a belief in, that we can make the world a better place. Somewhere in our 30s or 40s, idealism further bifurcates, and it goes either into cynicism or into wisdom. Cynicism, I've been there, done that, I tried that, doesn't work, it's a crock. Our wisdom is the ability to see it's all part of the human trajectory. So all of us are going to experience, a bifurcation point where innocence gives way to something or other. And it's not a fall, it's part of the human trajectory. And so you're absolutely right. Since there wasn't a sin that precipitated this fall from grace, the idea of redemption is ridiculous. It's ridiculous anyway, because redemption literally means to buy back, redemptor, to buy back. And it's this crazy notion that God is so upset with us that we've sinned so badly that we've sold our souls to Satan, and that in order to buy us back from Satan, God had to do a deal, and he had to give it the only perfect human being that ever lived. He had to trade this perfect human being to buy back the rest of us, and that perfect being was Jesus Christ. It's a sick notion of who God is, that's what results. So if there isn't a fall, there's no notion of buying back. We don't have to buy ourselves back. We have to walk ourselves back and wake ourselves back. Redemption is a question of waking up, not being bought back by anybody. So, okay, we take one last question, Joe. Sorry.
Well, wasn't as I understand it, the story of the Garden of Eden was a metaphor written by the people of those times to try as a form of control regarding God as reward and punishment, and it was written for those times. As a metaphor.
Okay, Charlie. Most of what we find in the wisdom traditions is metaphorical and symbolic and parabolical. Because I've said to you many times that there are 4 languages when you talk about God. There's the kind of the cataphatic language, which is the language of attempting to describe God, as theologians attempt to do, say God has this quality, or lives here, or does this, or said that. And it's ridiculous because you can't describe God like that. There's parabolic language, which is, speaking in stories so that every person who listens can unpack it according to their own stage of evolution. And then there's evolutionary language, which traces the shift and the development of people's thinking. But the ultimate language when you speak about God is apophatic. And that is the language that says X, God is not X. Y, God is not Y. Z, God is not Z. So you can experience God, but you can't describe God. And so that's the ultimate thing. So everything we find written in any wisdom tradition is either metaphorical, cataphatic, or evolutionary. But it's not the language of God. Even to ascribe being to God itself, is an error, because being is a human category. So all we can say is that we experience something which is radically ineffable, and our experiences come in particular guises, and so we experience compassion sometimes, we experience patience sometimes, we experience difficulty sometimes, and we attribute all these kind of masks to whatever is up there, but we have no idea what's up there. It's the myth of the given writ large. Guys, you've been really, really patient. It's 11:20, and we still have to get on with Mass, so let's take a few minutes out and offer each other a sign of peace.